To make switching to the new Boost Mobile risk-free, we're offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
So why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Because you have nothing to lose. Boost Mobile is offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
No, I asked why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Oh.
Wouldn't.
Because you love wasting money as a way to punish yourself because your mother never showed you enough love as a child?
Whoa. Easy there.
Yeah.
Applies to online activations. Requires port in and auto pay. Customers activating in stores may be charged non-refundable activation fees.
This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first, call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee with your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 an order. Additional terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Super real.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans, and you're listening to What It Was Like, the show that asks people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. I remember the first time I heard Nirvana. I was 15 years old. I was in a high school music class, and my teacher played Smells Like Teen Spirit. And I remember hearing that opening riff and just thinking, yes. Isn't it amazing how quickly the brain recognizes cool? And I think especially when you're a teenager, you know, your eyes, your ears, if they detect something cool, there's this circuit board that just lights up, and it takes less than a second. I think in this case, I'd heard probably 2 seconds, and there was just something about the tone of the guitar that sounded casual. You know, like that riff, it's so effortless, but it's also somehow this partially ironic study of all the guitar riffs that had ever come before. And I was just sucked in, and then Dave Grohl's those big tom-toms, you know, they boom, 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 they come in, and I was just like, oh yeah, baby. And I was sold. And from then on, I was a huge fan. I got all of the albums. I had this big Nirvana poster on my wall. I used to listen to Nirvana constantly on my Sony Discman. I did that thing where I tried to get my parents interested, but they weren't buying it. And I think I spent a lot of time just thinking about how fun it would have been to be listening to the radio in 1991 when Smells Like Teen Spirit was new when it first came out. And I felt like I just missed it. Like I missed the whole thing. So I was 15 in about 2002. So Kurt, you know, he was dead and buried. I missed the boat, and it's why I wanted to do this episode today. So I think this episode's about 2 things. First, it's just for me. I just want to know what it was like being there when Nirvana blew up. But secondly, I want to know how this big moment in pop history came about. I'm really interested in how culture gets engineered. I think it's sometimes easy to think of a really ubiquitous product or art form as the outcome of some organic process. But surprisingly, these things are really carefully engineered. Of course, everyone wears Nike sneakers not because they'd always been here, but because some guy named Phil Knight spent decades believing that we should. Or in this case, we all know there's a song called Smells Like Teen Spirit, and we all kind of know how it goes because a handful of people dedicated a lot of time and energy into making that song a hit. And for the architects of these products that become cultural phenomena, these are big experiences. I think for anyone who helps to birth a cultural movement, It's a hell of a ride, and I want to know what that's like. So today, I'm speaking with Danny Goldberg, who was Nirvana's manager from 1990 to Kurt's death in 1994. He came on when they were an underground punk band with a single album, and Kurt Cobain was writing songs for a new album that would eventually become Nevermind. We discuss Danny's memories of Kurt, the wild ride of success, and what he learned about life and legacy, having engineered a huge moment in global culture. So to tell that story, here is Danny Goldberg. Hey Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Let's start with your childhood. Let's go all the way back there. Yeah, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a suburb of New York City called Hastings-on-Hudson.
Okay, then tell me about what role music played in your early life.
When I was very little, my parents listened to a lot of classical and folk music, and I just kind of took on their taste, as well as the cast albums from Three Penny Opera and West Side Story. Those were the earliest sort of things I remember being in love with. I liked classical music as a kid, but a big turning point for me came when I was about 14, discovered marijuana, and at the same time discovered Phil Oakes, who was an American singer-songwriter who wrote about political issues as well as personal things, and this was at the peak of the Vietnam War. I graduated from high school in 1967, and those last couple of years of school were very rich years in terms of what we today call classic rock. You know, the Bob Dylan, a huge impact on me. I remember the first time I heard Ballad of a Thin Man, and a lot of the late 60s rock and roll, R&B and blues was played at all the parties I went to, and that music has certainly made me an ardent fan. So that included people like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Muddy Waters, the Beatles, the Stones, you know, long list, a typical list of what was happening at that time. And I've worked with all different kinds of music. There's a particular emotional resonance that the records that I listened to when I was 14, 15, 16, and 17 still have.
Yeah. Now, you weren't the only young man in the late 60s listening to these classic albums. And
correct.
And
millions of people were, yes.
That's right. But you weren't the only young man dreaming of a career in music at that time. So how did you break in? How did you do it?
I really didn't know that there was such a thing as the music business, or that one could have a career working with music. I didn't play any instruments, so I knew I couldn't be a musician, and I couldn't sing on pitch. So I had no aspirations to be a musician or a performer. But after I dropped out of college when I was 18, I needed a job, and so I could get my own apartment. And I saw an ad in the New York Times. A clerk wanted a magazine, and I had written for the high school newspaper and felt the magazine at least seemed a little more comfortable to me. And the magazine turned out to be Billboard, which is the American trade magazine that covers the music business then and now. And after I got the job, I discovered there was this business. There were people on the other end of the office that were getting paid to go to concerts and write their opinions about them. And I felt this is something I could do. So I talked them into letting me cover the shows that the older writers didn't want to cover. Old in those days meant people in their 30s. You know, I got a byline covering a few of them, and that's the magic thing about being a journalist, is your name is quickly associated with your work, which isn't true of most jobs, especially when you're young. I got lucky enough to be assigned to cover the Woodstock Festival, because none of the older writers wanted to do it, and my ecstatic review of Woodstock still lives on somewhere on Google. You know,
we should just double click on that for a minute. How was Woodstock?
Well, I was really excited to be there. I had just turned 19. I was in a non-drug period in my life. When I was younger, I was quite druggy, but by the time I was working, I was really had stopped all that. I just didn't want to be. For me, it would have been self-destructive at that time. So I was not stoned, but I was intoxicated by the camaraderie and the sweetness of the crowd. It was really kind of it was kind of a manifestation of a lot of the wistful hopes for some kind of new society that the hippie counterculture that I had been quite taken with had talked about. Obviously, it did not last, but I was very, very happy to be there. I was very lucky. I had a hotel room, because I was had an assignment from the magazine, and the promoters had a certain amount of rooms assigned for journalists. So 99% of the people who were there were sleeping on the grass. I wasn't. It's very hard all these years later to separate some of my memories of the music from when I was there from the movie Woodstock, which obviously I've seen a few times and which was, to me, a pretty accurate document of the festival. But I do know when I got there, Santana was on stage because, you got there at different times depending on traffic patterns and everything like that. And I had never heard of Santana. They either just released their record or were just about to. And I was really blown away by Carlos Santana's guitar playing and the whole vibe of it. So that was a great start. And I remember a handful of other artists. Like I said, it's and some of them I remember from the movie. So it's hard to separate out. But obviously, Joan Baez was a high point, and Jimi Hendrix and so forth. I was asleep by the time Sly and the Family Stone came on, so that I only saw in the movie. But it was a great to be there. I was very, very lucky, and I wrote about it with great passion, enthusiasm, and Billboard put it on the cover. It was the only time I ever wrote something for them that was on their front page. So it was a nice early milestone in my career.
Okay. So how did you graduate from journalism into management?
Well, I couldn't really make a living as a journalist. I tried for a few years. I worked for Circus Magazine, which was kind of an American rock magazine that had color pictures. That was their thing. And I wrote some record reviews for Rolling Stone, but I didn't quite have the discipline or the talent or the attitude that made for the handful of rock critics or rock writers that were able to actually make a living doing it. And so after a few years of trying and being really worried about just literally being able to pay my rent, I got a job as a publicist, which at the times felt like a failure, but it turned out to be a very, very good thing for me because I was a much better publicist than I was a journalist, because my main attitude about music was that I was a fan. I didn't like being critical of artists. I liked championing them, which is exactly what a publicist is supposed to do and not really what a critic is supposed to do. And that was for a PR company in New York called Salters and Roskin. They were a big showbiz company that had Frank Sinatra and Broadway musicals and Barbra Streisand and Las Vegas comedians. And I was the long-haired rock guy. And I was there a few months. I started working there at the beginning of 1973, and just a few months later, my boss, Lee Salters, who was several decades older than me, asked me if I'd ever heard of Led Zeppelin and if they would be a good client. And I told him yes. At this time, Zeppelin already was the biggest band in the world. Their previous album was the one with Stairway to Heaven on it. And so we went. We went to Paris to meet with the band and to meet with their manager, Peter Grant. And after that meeting, I was Led Zeppelin's American publicist. Lee didn't have anything against them, but he didn't care about the music or the culture. I was the young guy that was supposed to do that, and that was, just a great opportunity. They were, like I said, the biggest band in the world. They liked me enough that they, a year later, hired me to be vice president of their newly formed American record label, Swan Song. And, that's more than 50 years ago. And to this day, people still ask me what was it like working with Led Zeppelin at that time. So it was the kind of branding for me that really gave me an ability to go on with the rest of my career, after I stopped working for them a few years later. So that was a definite, that was the key turning point. But in working for Zeppelin, I worked for their manager, Peter, and Peter Grant was a very powerful guy. He was physically powerful, 300 pounds, former professional wrestler, very tough guy, kind of from working class British Cockney roots, much feared and respected in the music business. But to me, he was very, very nice. And I saw him as this powerful guy, the closest person to the band, the record company and the promoters who all kind of did what he wanted. And I thought, that's a good job. How do I get that job? So that's when I had the aspiration to be a manager, is by looking at the role he played. It took me a few years to be able to actually talk artists into letting me be their manager. So in between, I was still a publicist. But once I worked for Zeppelin, that was what I was sort of aiming for, was to be a manager.
Okay, all right. I want to talk about the nuts and bolts of being a manager, but first, I've got to ask the question that we just quickly glossed over. Was, how was it being around Zeppelin at the peak of their success?
Well, I worked for them from the middle of 1973 to the middle of 1976. And it was amazing. I mean, I had never been around a big tour, and they were in limos all the time. And the groupies wanting to get backstage, and the vastness of the equipment, the lights and the sound. This was all new to me as a critic. As a journalist, I hadn't seen that stuff. The closest relationship I had with the members of the band was with Robert Plant, because he was the most interested in the press, and he was just a very kind of outgoing, friendly guy. John Paul Jones and Bonham really were not interested in the press. They were musical geniuses, but I had less contact with them. And Jimmy Page was a little more kept to himself, but he was the first among equals. So whenever he wanted something, I mean, that was trumped everything else. But I was quite taken with it. It was very intoxicating to suddenly be part of their entourage, and it was really amazing. I mean, there was a lot of cocaine around, and it didn't always bring out the best behavior in people, and that could be stressful. And there's an inherent stress in trying to please a big band like that and their manager. But it was certainly a transformative experience, and they were really at their peak creatively. I mean, those shows in 73 and 75, I really only worked for them in the United States. I didn't have anything to do with their careers in Europe or Australia or anywhere else, but the U.S. is a big market. So they were great. Led Zeppelin, and they were very, very, very a good live band. They were on the cutting edge at that time in terms of what the sound system was like and the lights. And they took their shows very seriously. They did. There's a lot of books about how much they like to party and the girls and the groupies and all those things. I'm not saying those things weren't there, but they took the shows very seriously. And there were very few shows that weren't good. I mean, there were a couple that weren't that great, but the vast majority of them were great. And I think there's recordings from that period that bear that out.
What did you learn about management from that experience?
Well, the main thing I learned from Peter Grant was his philosophy was, and he drilled this into me, and it was a small organization that was involved with Zeppelin, a couple of executives in New York and a couple in London. And it was that we work for the band, and it was, don't worry about what the record company thinks. Don't worry about what the promoter thinks. Don't worry about what the media thinks. Fuck them all. We work for the band. And that notion of the manager as an advocate for the artist, and to kind of almost merge your mind into that role, that was really a North Star for me later when I became a manager. And I would often, I still periodically will think, but certainly when I work with Nirvana, I would think of what would Peter Grant do in this situation. So that was the main thing, was to remember who you work for. And there's so many big egos in the business, including managers, and people wanting to get their point of view across, people having their needs. And to do a good job, you have to respect and hear that and try to deal with those needs, but to never forget who you work for. That was really the main thing.
Yeah. All right, so let's fast forward to 1990. And at that point, you were running your own business. Tell me a bit about that period.
By 1990, I'm now 40 years old. I've been in the business for 20 years. I had my own company called Gold Mountain Entertainment that I'd started in the late 1980s, and that was a management company. It was a company with 30, 40 employees and different managers working on different artists. And I knew that there was this new kind of wave of rock and roll appealing to younger people in their teens and 20s that was very influenced by punk rock, and particularly by the American punk rock of the earlier in the 80s that I didn't have a visceral feel for. But I knew you could feel that it was coming. REM had become successful. Jane's Addiction had become successful. And it was clear these were very different culturally, and in some instances musically, from the rock and roll of the 70s. And so I hired a younger guy named John Silva, who today is one of the most successful rock and roll managers. He has the Foo Fighters and Nora Jones and many, many other big things. At that time, he was a struggling up and coming guy, but he had an encyclopedic knowledge of that kind of American punk culture and the fanzines and the 7-inches and could speak that language. And I knew the music business and the people who ran the record companies and the broadcasters and the media and so on. So we set out to try to find some artists in this younger rock area. And within about 6 months of working together, we were able to sign Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth was so respected in the U.S. They were tastemakers, part of the rock world. And I was very taken with the members of Sonic Youth, particularly Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon. And Thurston in particular, was just someone who I had enormous respect for, not only as a great musician, but also as someone who had his finger on the pulse of that generation of rock artists. And he loved Nirvana, and the Nirvana had opened for Sonic Youth, I think, on a European tour. John Silva had seen them and told me, look, we should look at this band Nirvana. And I was very worried about quote unquote new artists, because when you're running a management company, you're paying your bills based on commissions from current business. It's not like being a record company or a music publisher where you're owning copyrights and masters that you could later monetize. It's a cash business, and it usually takes a year or two for new artists to make money. So I was always very resistant to quote unquote brand new artists because of just the practicalities of running a management business. But Thurston called me and he said, look, this is the best band I've seen, and you should really make an exception for it. So I trusted him. And as a result, John and I, met with Nirvana. John, of course, had been right about them. And very quickly we became their manager.
Do you remember that first meeting? What stands out? I
do. Yeah, we met them. I had an office in Hollywood near Universal City. They came down to L.A. I think they were still living in Seattle, but they wanted a manager, and they were having meetings. And they had also had overtures from record companies, because they'd put out the album Bleach that was on the indie label Sub Pop. And although some artists really had this almost theological commitment to the idea of being on indie labels, that was not how Kurt Cobain felt. He liked the people at Sub Pop, but he didn't like when they'd get into a city on tour and the record company wouldn't have records in the store. And they'd seen Sonic Youth go to Geffen Records and not lose any of their integrity or any of their credibility in the subculture, but having more financial stability as a result. So they were interested in having a manager and a label. So in the early stages, Dave Grohl had just joined the group a few weeks earlier. So he did very, very little talking. The only thing I remember Dave talking to me about was what was John Bonham like, because he idolized Zeppelin's drummer, John Bonham, as you can tell from Dave's playing today. And I tried to trot out one or two John Bonham anecdotes. But Chris Novoselic, for the first 15 or 20 minutes, did most of the talking. Very voluble, very friendly, as he is today. Pretty political, as I was also pretty political, and we shared that in common. And Kurt was just kind of sitting there not saying anything, and he was physically the smallest of the three. And then at one point, I was trying to figure out, were they interested in being on a major label or staying on Sub Pop? It hadn't been clear yet. And I said, so do you want to stay on Sub Pop? And suddenly Kurt piped up and said, absolutely not. And he gave just a couple of sentences. But what I realized was not only that they wanted to be on a major label at that moment in time, but that he was the boss, because it wasn't like a question. So literally within 24 hours, we agreed that we'd be their manager, and the task was then to figure out what label we should talk to. By this time in the music business in America, because of those artists I mentioned, like Jane's Addiction and some others that were coming up, the Pixies and others, the A&R people were paying a lot of attention to music coming out of Seattle. There was an awareness that Seattle was producing some music that was being accepted in other parts of the world and in the punk subculture. And Nirvana, even though they only sold about 30,000 albums and hadn't made any money from Bleach, that album did give them enough visibility that attracted the interest of 5 or 6 labels. So our job was to go through that process and figure out who they should be with. And it was always obvious to me that Geffen was the right place because we'd had a good experience with Geffen and Sonic Youth. So they went through the motions of having a few meetings, but they came to the same conclusion. Again, so much of Nirvana's business decisions were just simply following in Sonic Youth's footsteps, both as management and for the label.
Yeah. I'm curious about the way that a lot of Kurt and sort of Nirvana's ethos seems to be about anti-establishment, rebellion, and yet they were very enthusiastically trying to get a major label on their side.
But I don't think Kurt ever looked at the identity of the label as being particularly important to the idea of integrity. He was anti-sexist. He was anti-homophobia. He didn't like a lot of the commercial rock and roll at that time. He felt it had a shallowness and a macho swagger that offended him. But the idea, how that music was brought to the public, they just didn't buy into that idea that that was a mark of integrity or lack of it, or rebelliousness or lack of it. But he had a vision of who he wanted to be, and it's who he became as an artist, and he wanted the tools to be able to accomplish that vision.
Yeah. I'm keen to get into Kurt. Is quite a close study of fame and how to achieve it, and the sort of the mechanics of celebrity. So I want to get into that, but let's just talk about the experience of seeing them live for the first time.
Well, when we first signed them, as I mentioned earlier, we had about, I think 30 people at the company and 30 or 40 artists, and I was just trying to keep the business going and responding to whatever pressures of the day were there. And so I had never seen them live. I hadn't gone to Europe when they opened the Sonic Youth there. And finally, after a couple of months, when they were on the roster and they were a few months away from going in to record the album that became Nevermind, I realized I really ought to see them once from their manager. And they were playing Los Angeles because Kurt wanted to play some shows where he could sort of try out some of the songs that were going to be on Nevermind in front of audiences. Some artists like to do that before they record to just get a sense of how certain songs connect with audiences. And they opened to the band Dinosaur Jr. at an LA rock club called The Palace, probably holds 700-800 people, standing audience. And, I just, I went by myself on my, after work before going home, and I was just mesmerized by the band. I was very surprised at the level of connection Kurt had with the audience. I don't really exactly know how to describe it. It was just like, even though they were the opening act, and he wasn't flamboyant in a theatrical way during this particular show, there was an intensity about him and a connection with the audience that was just palpable. And that's when I realized how lucky I was that I listened to Thurston and that the band had wanted to work with us. At that moment, my level of interest in the band increased substantially in terms of what they might mean to the business, and I paid quite a bit more attention to them after that. And in general, they were a great live band. Nirvana, Kurt had drug problems, and he had prone to depression, and that's widely known, but but he also rehearsed a lot. He was a craftsman when it came to music. He had whatever angst, pain, depression, or confusion he had in other aspects of his life. He had this crystalline clarity about his career and about his role as an artist. And they were a tight band. There was nothing sloppy about a Nirvana show. They rehearsed a lot. And when they got on stage, they knew what they were doing and focused on connecting with the audience. There were very, very few bad Nirvana shows. There were a couple, but very few. They were a very, very good band.
You said before that this period, the 90s, there was this sort of grunge sound, this sort of punk rock thing that you didn't like innately connect with. Your sensibilities were calibrated in an earlier phase of rock and roll history. So when you first saw Nirvana, what did the music, did it reach you? Did you feel it?
Well, the thing about Nirvana, and Kurt in particular, was that he wrote songs with choruses that were memorable. And he also had this extraordinary voice. So while on the one hand, there was a punk sensibility that punk fans processed as their own, his talents as a singer and a songwriter were not limited to punk. They were very easy for somebody like me to understand. And that's why I think they became so much bigger commercially than the other punk bands, was the combination of particularly the songwriting, but also his vocals. So to hear a demo or the early track of In Bloom or one of the first of the songs I remember that was written before some of the other songs on Nevermind. I mean, it had a chorus you could hum after one listen. So that was the magic of his talent. Was he was in 4 or 5 different genres at the same time. There were metal fans that liked Nirvana because of that kind of intensity. The punk community saw them as one of their own. But they also had pop hits, I was my job was to be a professional, not to. I mean, I was a fan, but again, I'm 40 years old. I'm trying to make a living. I'm trying to provide meaningful services to the artists that pay me, and that was a different headspace than just being a fan. But I could also be a fan of Nirvana because of the songs. He was just that talented a songwriter. To this day, I'm just marvel at just the richness of his vocals and the brilliance of those songs. That's what separated them from the other punk bands of the time.
Yeah. It seems to me like when you see movies of defining moments in pop culture history, there's often a scene where sort of a lead character hears some song that goes on to become world famous, and there's like this moment where they go, "Oh my God, this is going to be the greatest song in the history of the world." I'm curious, did you have this sort of moment of clarity where you heard them for the first time and you just went, "Yes"?
No, not to the level that they achieved. I think all of us that were involved with the band, the people at Geffen Records, their A&R guy, Gary Gersh, and the Mark Cates, who was the main promotion guy there that understood that kind of music, and Silva, and the other people in our office, we all knew that there were some really good songs. And my big argument to Geffen was they're going to be bigger than Sonic Youth. And to put it in mathematical terms, I think Sonic Youth's Goo album, which was their best-selling album, sold something like 150,000 in the United States. And, Nevermind went on to sell well over 10 million. I had no idea it was going to be what it was, but I knew it was going to be bigger than Sonic Youth. Kurt's dream was to be as big as the Pixies. That's what he always said. They would like sell 300,000. And Butch Vig, who produced Nevermind, had produced the Smashing Pumpkins Gish album, and that also sold about 300,000. So that was sort of as far on the horizon as most of us could see. I was a little greedier than everyone else because I was a little older. So I kept looking at Jane's Addiction as the horizon, and I think they were at 800,000 or 900,000. But and we all knew that "Smells Like Teen Spirit" was a great song. There was no question it was a great song. But I don't remember anyone thinking, but I certainly didn't think that it was going to be a pop song. We just thought it was going to be like a cool identity song. I think the music video was certainly changed the paradigm in terms of sensing what it could be. And then that was one of those songs that when radio stations played it within 24 hours, they were getting a lot of phone calls from people wanting to hear it again. So it became apparent literally within a week or two of the song being released, even before the album came out, that it had a far greater potential than what we had expected. But up until that moment, I don't remember anyone saying, gee, this is going to be a number one album or they're going to be one of the biggest bands in the world. It took a week or two of seeing how the public reacted to it before the new paradigm took hold. But it was no more than a week or two.
You know, you had front row seats to this and I didn't. But if I had to guess, for me, it's just the power of those opening riffs on Smells Like Teen Spirit. I remember the first time I heard that and I just went, yes, like I want to listen to this forever.
Yeah. Well, it definitely, what can we say? It's one of the great rock songs of all time, but it was, it took a minute between seeing it from a great song to a massive song. And I think all of us were surprised at the intensity level. I remember talking to the label people because the people at Geffen who were into Nirvana was only a minority of the people who worked at the record company. That was a company that had, Guns N' Roses and mainstream rock. And there were only a couple of people who worked there that were paying attention to this punk subculture. So we decided to do a showcase for the rest of the label to see what the band could do just before the record came out. And they played a club on Sunset Strip in Hollywood called the Roxy. Probably holds about 300 people. And virtually everyone from the label was there. That was the main reason we did the show, although 100 or so members of the public came also. And I remember walking out afterwards with several of the Geffen executives, and they were all saying, oh my God, that's one of the best shows we've seen. They're so great, blah, blah, blah. But the head of marketing was saying, well, let's not kid ourselves, though. It's still a punk band, And then 2 weeks later, that was not the conversation that I was having with that same person because there was no precedent for it. Nothing had come out of the punk subculture that was mass appeal. The Sex Pistols record was a cult record in the United States. It did pretty well, and it was in the press a lot because they were very press friendly, but it wasn't commercially in the same league as Zeppelin or Guns N' Roses or Aerosmith or the other mass bands. And Nirvana broke into that club commercially while maintaining their punk credibility with critics and with those fans within weeks. But until they did it, no one had done it.
Yeah. I love the way that it's, in retrospect, everything makes sense. But then, of course, at the time, you're looking at it through a business lens of what are the precedents here? What's the case for this doing well, or what's it likely to do based on our prior experience?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, it was the aspirations went from being as big as the Pixies to being the biggest band in the world pretty quickly, but it did take a couple of minutes.
Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
To make switching to the new Boost Mobile risk-free, we're offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
So why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Because you have nothing to lose. Boost Mobile is offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
No, I asked why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Oh.
Wouldn't.
Because you love wasting money as a way to punish yourself because your mother never showed you enough love as a child?
Whoa. Easy there.
Yeah.
Applies to online activations. Requires port-in and auto-pay. Customers activating in stores may be charged non-refundable activation fees.
This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first, call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee with your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 an order. Additional terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
As a manager, you said before that your primary job is to look after the client. Was there, and has there ever been any reservation taking on clients? Like, Kurt's a prickly, sort of difficult, moody guy with a drug addiction, you said. Is there any reservation of like, this could be hard,
Well, I didn't know and neither John or I, people in the company, we didn't know he was a drug addict at the time, and he wasn't. I think I later learned he had done heroin when he was younger and always liked it, but there was no evidence of that when we first started working with him. I mean, that's certainly a red flag. I wouldn't consciously work with an alcoholic or drug addict. Unless they were, in a 12-step program and it was in the rearview mirror of their life. But in terms of moodiness or temperament, my goodness, that's an artist. I mean, artists are moody, temperamental, highly sensitive people. And if you don't want to work with moody people, you shouldn't be a manager. So that's, to me, I love artists. I love that they're in tune and hear things that we don't hear and see things that we don't see. And they're a bridge between some sort of vague essence of beauty that can communicate to normal people. So I idolize artists. I always have. And that's why I do what I do. But certainly wouldn't consciously work with a drug addict. But if you're working with someone and they become a drug addict or they become revealed as one, it's a different set of choices to make, But it's obviously a horrible disease, a horrible result in many cases. But as far as being moody or weird or different, I mean, that's, artists, their job is to make great art, not to be, the most charming people at cocktail parties. Although some of them are very charming, but that's not the criteria. The criteria is the art itself.
Yeah. Okay, so let's drop in on the recording of Nevermind. What can you tell me about that process? What stands out to you?
I was not in the studio very much. It's never been my thing. But I wrote this book that came out a few years ago called "Serving the Servant," which was my memories of Kurt. And one of the people I spoke to at some length about it was Butch Vig, who produced the record. And so a lot of what I'm saying is really kind of repeating what he told me, more than my own firsthand memories. But the main thing I can tell you about that, and which I did know, is that Kurt wanted them to be completely rehearsed before they went into the studio. So we rented them a rehearsal studio I think it was in Burbank. I know they had these apartments, these short-term apartments in Burbank, and they went in for months playing the songs over and over and over again. Kurt was just a taskmaster at wanting to have everything rehearsed and planned out. And Butch Vig said he just couldn't believe when they got into the studio it was so fast to record the record because they were so well prepared. Kurt's best vocals were often the first take vocals. He said there's almost no electronics on the record in terms of echo or any kind of other effects. People later talked about the commercial production as if Butch had somehow made some major label imprint onto this punk band. But the recording itself was not that different than it would have been, for the indie label. It was just the band itself was that tight, and Kurt's vocals were that big. That's what it sounded like. So it went quite quickly. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks to record the whole record. then Gary Gersh called us for a meeting at Geffen. He was the A&R guy that had signed them. He'd also been the A&R guy there that had signed Sonic Youth, and he was nervous that the mixes didn't do justice to the songs. And I'm not sure I would have thought of that myself, but the minute he said it, I understood what he was getting at. He was particularly concerned about the drum sound and the brightness of the vocals. And Kurt got it also. So Kurt wasn't 100% convinced that he'd want to use a different mixer ultimately, but he was willing to try it. It wasn't that expensive to have someone else mix it. And Andy Wallace, who had best known then for metal, he had done band Slayer, but he just had a good head for mixing. Andy Wallace remixed the record, and Kurt immediately approved the Andy Wallace mixes and preferred them to the original mixes. So that was the one adjustment that was made in the recording, was it was remixed.
Okay. And I understand there's a moment in your book where you talk about Kurt had this idea about using an eye test, some eye test imagery on the album art.
Oh, it's for the art. Oh, it's for the album cover artwork. Yeah. Then yeah, for the album cover, we didn't know when he was first doing the record that he was going to call it Nevermind. And in terms of just trying to figure out the artwork, yeah, this one idea. He was fascinated by medical things, images and equipment, and he had this idea that maybe they used something like the graphics that are on an eye test when you're getting to see whether or not you need glasses. I think John told me about it. I was a little nervous about it because I just had known in head shops, there used to be these stores called head shops that would have posters of, Jimi Hendrix or various celebrities. And it seemed to me that I'd seen eye test type things there, and I was worried it wasn't quite as an original an image as he thought. And I mentioned it to him. Not that my role was typically to make creative suggestions, and not that he had any, he made all the decisions, but he was interested in what other people had to say, and he wanted to listen. All I know is he dropped the eye test idea and came up with the idea of the cover that was eventually the cover of Nevermind, which was to have a picture of a baby grasping for a dollar bill on a fishhook, as kind of a metaphor for how materialism is corrupting at a very young age. And then it was implemented. I think John found the kid that later on, recently has sued them. But at the time, the kid's parents were quite happy to take the money, and it became kind of one of these very famous album covers. But the image and the concept of the artwork were 100% Kurt's, which was the case on all of the Nirvana albums. Kurt conceptualized and directed all of the artwork. He conceptualized and wrote out scene by scene all the music videos. He made every single creative decision connected to the band, and pretty good track record of those decisions.
Well, let's talk about the album coming out. And I think really the hook to this whole story is that you were at the helm of a cultural phenomenon. It blew up. It changed the world in some. It's a lofty sentence, but it certainly changed music.
Well, it changed certainly the rock world and the music business. That's factual. Yeah, it created a new category of commerciality. I mean, prior to that, it was a niche genre, and once Nirvana opened that door, Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and it created it overnight changed what was mainstream rock and roll. Yeah.
So what's it like helping to build a cultural phenomenon?
Well, it was very enjoyable, to be one of the managers of this band. That album came out in September of '91, and by the end of the year, a few months later, it was #1. And it also took off in the rest of the world, in Australia and Europe and other parts of the world where people could get the record. It was a very, very fast-moving thing commercially, and it was also not only a hit, but it was also quite respected by critics. And that's a rarity, to have something that's both a pop phenomenon and a critical phenomenon. So it was really like it was really awesome, and it was just, I remember the New York Times, when it went to #1, did a story about the marketing of Nevermind, and they interviewed Eddie Rosenblatt, who just passed away a week or two ago, who was then the president of Geffen Records, and they said, what was the marketing plan? And he said, the marketing plan was get out of the way and duck. So that was that was true. But yeah, I mean, it was by January we realized Kurt's got a drug problem when they did the American TV show Saturday Night Live, and it was there'd been rumblings the few days before that which there was a journalist that had said that he thought Kurt was on dope, and dope, I mean heroin, and then it was pretty obvious at Saturday Night Live. So that honeymoon period lasted from sort of September to January.
Okay, it wasn't long.
And then from January of '92 on, the dark specter of drugs was always somewhere around for the rest of his life.
When you say that Saturday Night Live was kind of the moment that you realized, was that purely you were just watching it and you thought, yeah, geez, Kurt's out?
Well, we were there. It was in New York. I mean, they came there, and I'd been around the people with drug problems before. It wasn't like I didn't know what it looked like. And when I was younger, I had done heroin when I was 17 years old. But I never became a junkie, fortunately, because my brain chemistry just didn't operate that way. But I'd seen junkies before, and it was just, it was not hard to tell if you had any experience around that thing, at Saturday Night Live. Again, in the week before, there had been this article that came out. I think it was a Bay Area alternative weekly, where the guy strongly implied it. And, we're kind of, oh, gee, maybe they're exaggerating, or maybe it's just scandal mongering. So we were kind of alert to that it could be a problem. But then seeing him there, it was just it was quite clear it was a problem. And I think we did an intervention. When I say we, it was myself, my partner John Sylvan, Gary Gersh from the label, and a few other people. I think Chris was there too. We did an intervention with Kurt and Courtney, I think, within weeks after Saturday Night Live.
How did that go down?
Well, initially, it had the desired effect that they both went into rehab. It didn't have a permanent effect because, Kurt was in and out of treatment for the rest of his life and never really took to a 12-step program or, found his way out of it. But the short-term result was as desired.
I'd like to get back to Kurt's demons in a moment, but I'm curious about how your life had changed. You're the manager of the coolest band in the world. Like, that's pretty cool. If you're at a dinner party,
I'd been in the music business for a long time. I had quite a few other clients. There was no question that when Nirvana happened, there was there's this added glow that you get if you're working with somebody that's a phenomenon, whether you're the A&R person at the record company or the lawyer or the manager, or that glow lights all of us who work with an artist bask in that glow. So I may probably had a little extra swagger, but again, I had been doing it for a long time, and I had other clients and I had other things to think about, and it didn't change. I didn't buy a new car or change my lifestyle in any way, but it was, I was very proud to be involved with them. And it was really an amazing, not only because of the success, but because of the quality. It was not only successful, it was other artists respected him and the press respected him, and they were big. So it was really a great high point of a career, for me. Certainly, I still look at it as, if I had to pick one high point, that would be it. If anyone writes obituaries of me when I die, I'm sure the first line will be former Nirvana manager Danny Goldberg. There's nothing I can do or did do that's quite as culturally significant as that. But it was in the context of a 20-year career even then.
I find that sort of legacy stuff quite interesting because when you lay down on your deathbed and you think about the things that really truly mattered in your life, and you think about being a dad and you think about your various successes in business, this thing Nirvana that you helped to bring to the world, does it make you happy that you just had that one-off experience, or does it make you sad that that probably won't happen again?
Oh, no, it doesn't make me sad at all. I mean, every experience, this is an interesting experience right now. I try to appreciate every day if I can, certainly being a father of two now adult children. But from a career point of view, there's only one Nirvana. That's as it should be. I remember when the book came out, I did an event at the LA bookstore called Book Soup, and I asked my friend and then client Ben Lee, who Australian, to do the dialogue with me. He was then living in LA. He's moved back home now, and that was his first question. He says, this was 25 years ago, and how do you feel that it's the thing that you're probably going to always be the best known for? And I said, I am completely fine with that. Like, what a great thing to be, it's like, I'm not fine that Kurt's dead and that he was so unhappy before he died. But, in terms of as a career thing, there's one Nirvana. So I've developed a friendship over the years with Andrew Oldham, who's best known for working with the Rolling Stones. That was 60 years ago, but he's still quite happy that he got to manage and produce the Rolling Stones early on in their life. There's one Beatles, there's one Rolling Stones, there's one Bob Marley, there's one Bob Dylan, there's one Kurt Cobain. That's who these people are. If you're lucky enough to work with them, you know how rare they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's circle back to Kurt's ailing health and his drug addiction. So as time went on, 93, In Utero came out, and then I think it was also MTV Unplugged, and then we're getting into 94. Obviously,
well, Unplugged, the album came out after he died.
Okay, right. Yep.
Obviously he was alive when they did the Unplugged, and it broadcast, the TV show broadcast. But the album, which is one of the most popular Nirvana albums, came out after he died.
Yeah. I think In Utero, I think, is my favorite. If I had to pick,
it's my favorite. I think artistically, it's their best record. That's the most sophisticated songwriting he did.
Yeah,
those were some of the last songs he wrote. I like all of them, but if I had to pick a favorite, In Utero would be mine as well.
Do you have a favorite song?
Well, you do this kind of a thing, write a book about it. I've been asked that question a few times. I usually say All Apologies, although I would say I equally like the song on that album, Penny Royalty. And obviously, Heart-Shaped Box is probably the greatest melody he ever wrote. I mean, it's just what a melody that is. So those are the three. But usually, if I'm have to pick one, I usually say All Apologies. I don't even know why at this point, but that's what kind of pops out of my head.
Yeah. So let's. So sort of tell me about the last year or so. I imagine it was a pretty stressful time for you.
Well, anytime you're dealing with someone, with a drug problem, it's stressful. I had made a decision in my own life to leave the management business in between, kind of in between Nevermind and In Utero. I got offered to be the senior vice president of Atlantic Records, which was a label I'd long loved. And I was pretty sure that if I did a decent job there, I was be in line to become president, because I knew the guy that hired me wanted to move up corporately, and that is what happened. I did become, within a year, president of Atlantic. So my deal with Kurt, because by this time he was become dependent on me for a certain kind of advice, and I wouldn't say dependent, but he wanted to have it, as did Courtney. So I was in touch with him, but I'd moved back to New York. It was a lot of it was on the phone, but I just was terribly worried about him. When different things would happen. He overdosed in Italy, 6 or 8 weeks before he died, and it was definitely nerve-wracking, worrying. All of us tried to suggest different doctors or meditation, or he just didn't like 12 steps. And although 12 steps is not for everybody, I'm not personally in the program because by the grace of God, I haven't had that kind of addiction that I felt I needed to do it. But I have many, many people very, very close to me that are in it. It's the only thing I know to recommend to people that has a good track record of helping people overcome alcoholism or addiction. And he just wasn't into it. And there wasn't a plan B. I mean, he had different doctors that he liked, and one of them doctors died, all of us that knew him were very, very worried. It was a stressful, tough year, a lot of ups and downs, really from such a short period of time between Nevermind coming out and his death, 2.5 years, so a lot of stress along the way. And all of the stress was related to drugs. When he wasn't stoned, I mean, the thing with Kurt, and we haven't talked about this yet, and I just have to get it out. He was such a nice guy. I mean, he was an artist. He was kind of in his own world the way a lot of artists are, and he didn't like when people were mean to Courtney. And if he was stoned or physically in pain, he could be difficult. But most of the time, he was a funny, sweet, considerate, lovely person. When I did the book, just interviewing, it's a couple of dozen people that knew him. I mean, everybody had a story about that side of him. So, when he smiled, the world smiled with him. But, when he was down, it was really not fun. So, both sides of him were part of his true self. There wasn't one truth about him. There were many different aspects of him. But dealing with anybody who's a drug addict sucks.
Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
To get people excited about Boost Mobile's new nationwide 5G network, we're offering unlimited talk, text, and data for $25 a month.
Forever.
Even if you have a baby.
Even if your baby has a baby.
Even if you grow old and wrinkly and you start repeating yourself.
Even if you start repeating yourself.
Even if you're on your deathbed and you need to make one last call.
Or text.
Right, or text. The long-lost son you abandoned at birth.
You'll still get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile.
Forever!
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
Forever.
Do you have a story about his kindness? Something he did to you or said to you that stands out in your mind?
When I got to Atlantic, I wanted to sign acts that I had to make money for the company and I wanted to do well as an executive, but I also wanted to impress him. And so he loved the band Captain America. That was one of his favorite bands, a Scottish band. He had worn a Captain America t-shirt for a photo on the cover of Melody Maker, I think, in England, that helped get the record deal. So I want to sign Captain America. Unfortunately, by the time I got to Atlanta, Captain America had broken up, and the guy Eugene Kelly, who was the lead singer, had formed a new band called Eugenius. So I signed Eugenius, and they were on a tour opening, I think, to the Lemonheads, who were also on Atlantic, and they play L.A., and Kurt came to the show because he loved Eugenius, he loved Eugene Kelly, wanted to say hi to him. And we're there, and Kurt looks at me, he says, "Let's take a photo." And he put his arm around me, and he brought a photographer over. And he knew he was doing it for me. He didn't need a photo with me, but he knew I'd want that moment. And that's the photo that's in the book. I have that photo framed on my office wall to this day. Or another time, I had this political side of me. I was chair of the what's called the American Civil Liberties Union in Los Angeles, which is kind of left-leaning free speech, and it has a pro-choice and gay rights and other things like that. So I would never tell the people in my music life what I was doing in the political life because I didn't want to impose on them. And I don't care if people, disagree with me on a political thing if I still work with it. I didn't want to make it like a thing. So I was supposed to do this this debate with a right-wing radio talk host. at a Jewish at Hillel, that a rabbi was presiding over these series of discussions about the separation between church and state. Such a wonky, obscure thing. And I literally didn't mention it to anyone in the office, because I just certainly didn't, I never wanted to like make people think they like had to show up. It was just something I did kind of from my head. And I'm sitting there in this academic room with a couple hundred people, and there's Kurt and Courtney sitting there. Somehow they found out about it and decided to come. He was, so I have this debate with this guy, and this guy's a sophisticated demagogue. He's still on the radio in L.A., and I was really outmatched. I mean, I agreed with my opinions, but I didn't feel I was my most effective, and I was kind of in a bummer afterwards. And Kurt and Courtney and I went out to eat at a deli in Hollywood called Cantor's. And he was like trying to cheer me up and make, it was such a role reversal, saying that was total entertainment. Are you kidding me? It was so, just generally speaking, there's so many stories of his kindness to people.
He seems like such a massive contradictions. You talk about how he would often wear his pajamas late into the day, or he was sort of a bit sloppy, but then, he was training like an elite athlete to be in a big band. That's what he wanted. And there's so many contradictions to his personality.
Yeah. No, complicated guy. Yeah, he was very serious about his art. Very serious about his art. He'd work for hours and hours and hours to just get a chord progression right. He would, he was constantly doing drawings and paintings. And when it came to the band, like I said, he was very into rehearsal, and he controlled every detail of the mixes and the editing of the videos and all these sort of things. But other than that, he was somebody who had not had a great childhood and didn't have conventional education, and who was an outsider. And he's a lot of artists are complicated people, and he was one of the most complicated. Yeah.
You admitted before that you wanted to impress Kurt, and I thought that was interesting. Why? Why did you want to impress Kurt?
It's Kurt Cobain, I mean, it's like, you don't work with artists the way I do if you don't want them to like you. It's not the only reason to do it. You got to make money and everything. But even some of the most jaded, money-oriented people I know in the business still want to be liked by the people they work with. So, I don't think that's unusual an impulse, but it was certainly something that was in the back of my mind, particularly the way I tried to do things at Atlantic relative to the artists that he cared about. I mean, obviously at Atlantic we had all different kinds of artists, but there was a current of some of the A&R that was in the ballpark that he cared about, and I liked that was always in the back of my mind. I wanted him to think I was not a jerk.
Yeah, I'd want to impress him too. Let's fast forward to, it's sort of the last month of his life, and I understand you tried to stage an intervention. Can you walk me through that?
Well, that was the second intervention. I was in two interventions. The first one I mentioned to you was after Saturday Night Live, and then in '94, Courtney wanted another intervention. She called me. I was at Atlantic in New York. By this time, Atlantic Records is based in New York. They're living in Seattle. So she called me and said, "Look, he's the worst he's ever been. Please come. We've got to get him to go into treatment now." So I flew there, and I forget who else was there. I know Janet Billig, whose name is not Janet Billig Rich, was there, who worked still for the management company, and who was the person after I left Gold Mountain that was the closest to Kurt and Courtney. But I went there, and it was a bummer. But we talked him into going back into rehab, but obviously he didn't stay there very long. He left and went and killed himself. But that was so. The last time I saw him was about a week before he died.
I mean, I'm curious about this because it feels like the last hurrah. I don't know. It was a lifeboat, and I'm curious about your memories of it. Do you remember sitting in his house and how he appeared, how he received you?
Well, he was pretty he was in a pretty bad mood. I mean, no one, I don't think, in that situation is too thrilled about people suddenly invading their home and lecturing them. And he was his friend of his named Dylan Carlson, who's I think still alive and has gotten clean, has had an interesting career as an artist. I never got to know Dylan that well, but I remember him sitting with Dylan and different people taking turns trying to talk to him, and me trying to just persuade him to get clean. He was in a very bad mood.
What did you say?
Oh goodness. Like drug addicts tend to do, he was trying to deny that drugs were his problem and point the finger at other things. And I was just saying, I'll support anything you want to do if you don't want to tour, whatever you want to do in your personal life, but you can't make good decisions when you're strung out, So, I remember, there was some facilitator. I think that Janet found that, was an expert on interventions, an ex-drug addict, or, that was one of the techniques that sometimes people would recommend in these things. And Kurt just couldn't stand that guy. Nothing wrong with that guy. I think he was a nice guy, but he just meant well. I don't remember his name right now, but Kurt just wanted nothing to do with this stranger trying to lecture him on the theory that they had some brotherhood because that dude used to be a junkie. And of course, also Frances was a couple of years old and a lot of his life involved her. He loved her very much, but, when he was really fucked up, he couldn't concentrate as much on that relationship. But I just remember it was really depressing, and I remember I was worried that I had been too confrontational, and so when I got home, I called him, and my daughter Katie was then 3 or 4 years old. She knew him though from the time she was a baby, and she was a very precocious 3 or 4 year old, very articulate and very. Had a connection with him. I mean, he knew her before he knew Frances because Frances was born when my daughter was a year or two old. And so I just called him and said, look, man, I love you. And I'm just, if I said anything that upset you, it's not because I'm trying to, it's just I want what's best for you. And, and he says, oh, I know, this kind of, I love you too. And then I said, well, Katie's here. You say hi to her. And so she gets on the phone and she says, Kurt, you sound so grumpy. Why are you so grumpy? And then she gave the phone back to me and he said, all right, man, I got to go now. And that was the last, we ever spoke. So, it was generally speaking, it was not as depressing as the phone call a week later when I found out that he'd killed himself, but it was a tough day.
God. What do you remember about that second phone call?
Well, my ex-wife, I was then married to, Rosemary Carroll, who's also Kurt's lawyer and very close to him as well, and my daughter's mother called. By this time, I'm back in New York. She was pregnant with our second kid, so we had just given birth to our second kid, so didn't move to New York for another few months. So she called and told me what happened. And I'd been in a meeting in Atlantic with Stevie Nicks, who was about to do another solo album. She was now signed directly to Atlantic. I was in a meeting with her and Atlantic's general manager, Val Azzoli, and my assistant said, you got to take a call from your wife. And she told me what happened. It was like, obviously a horrible news to get, well, not totally surprising, but nonetheless dreadful and shocking.
Mm. Did you feel like you could have done more or done less or done something differently?
Well, I don't know that anyone in these situations ever completely gets rid of the feeling of wondering, gee, if I'd uttered this sentence, if I had made this suggestion, I mean, what could I have done? I think ultimately most of the literature on this and what the psychiatrists and people who study addiction would say is, it's up to the person. You can't, if someone's determined to kill themselves, they're going to do it. And I think in the U.S., 50 or 60,000 people a year kill themselves. And most of them are men, half of them are with guns, and very, very few of them are rock stars. They're mostly people with normal jobs who aren't worried about being famous or anything else like that, but just have a have a psychological flaw that causes them to do that. It's an ancient problem, and there's no. So I always I certainly have wondered if there was something else that could have been done, but at the time, anything we could think of, it's not like we didn't know he had a drug problem. We didn't know he was literally going to shoot himself in the head, but any doctor that anyone knew, any therapist, any program, anyone who came up with an idea, we'd bring it to him, and he'd try different things, and it wasn't like there weren't efforts made. But ultimately, it's up to the person themselves if they want to, which direction they want to go. And he unfortunately chose that path.
Yeah. I mean, as an outsider, it feels to me, just looking at his lyrics, listening to his music, that he always had a depressive streak that was, I don't know.
Oh, no, there's no question. He was a depressive. I mean, there's stories about him. Butch Vig said when doing Nevermind, as great as the recording went, he said there were a couple of times where Kurt would just zone out and just take a walk and not talk to anyone. And Chris said, "Don't worry, Kurt gets like that sometimes. So he'll come out of it. He'll come back." So I mean, he was prone to these pools of depression, and tried all different kinds of antidepressants and whatever chemical things you can do about that, and just nothing worked. But no, he'd done heroin before he was famous. He was prone to depression before he was famous. There's a glib assumption that some journalists made, oh, this is what fame does. But most famous people don't kill themselves, and most people who kill themselves aren't famous.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of people who want to be rock stars. There's a lot of people who practice obsessively, and Kurt certainly did. What did you learn about musical genius, creative genius? Was it just in his blood, or was it a product of his training and his thinking and his sort of dedication to the craft?
Well, I don't know that you can I think he was certainly born to be an artist. To be the kind of artist he wanted to be required mastery of various crafts. Those came to him. He had the talent. He had the God-given talent. So, I mean, I think people are born or not with talent or not, and then there are different talents, plural. One of them is to be able to write a song, to be able to play the guitar, what your voice is like, and then there's also what I want, kind of having a talent for having talent, which is to have the other set of gifts to understand how to harness it and communicate it, and in the commercial realm to sell it. And that was also one of his talents. But I think he was born to do it. I don't think you can teach someone how to be Kurt Cobain. I think some people, like great athletes, same thing. You got to do the work. But if you're not born with the certain qualities, no matter how much work you do, you're not going to become, Simone Biles. But I think that I just think there are people that are special in that area, and then, like I said, he had multiple talents. He didn't have a talent for dealing with his angst, his pain, and his depressions and everything like that. But as an artist and as a performer, he was the full package of, again, great songwriter, great singer, media genius, and understood how to be in a band and to communicate with other musicians, and how to perform. Those are things that just came to him naturally.
Yeah. Last question. Was your experience with Nirvana a happy one?
Well, it was both. There were very happy moments and very unhappy moments. I mean, obviously based on the things we've talked about. I mean, I'm grateful I got to do it. I wish he wasn't dead. I mean, what else can I say?
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. That's how I feel.
I don't think a day goes by where I don't see someone wearing a Nirvana t-shirt. And most of the people wearing them weren't even alive when those records came out. And it's an amazing thing to have made that kind of impact as an artist, separate and apart from his life. And I think there's something about how deep he went in terms of being faithful to his own emotions and feelings and empathizing with other people's pain that transcends the musical fashions of punk or rock or the certain kind of radio stations or certain kind of delivery system of media. And that's a rare artist. It's very hard to be successful. The odds are 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. And then among those people who are successful, most of them are only successful within their time. So he's one of those very rare artists that are successful, transcends his time and generation. Again, there are others in the rock idiom that have done it, but it's a very short list, and he's definitely on it.
Yeah, and you were there. It's it's a kind of a gift for you too.
Oh, I'm so grateful for it. It's again, the fact that halfway around the world you want to talk to me for an hour and a half about something I did 30 years ago is a tribute to his talent, and it's an amazing opportunity. When you can get to be around people that are that special.
Well, thank you so much, Danny. Thanks for talking to me. Danny has also written a bunch of books. For his full Nirvana story, and there is heaps more, believe me, we covered just a fraction of it today. Check out Serving the Servant, Remembering Kurt Cobain. It's available, lots of bookstores, all over Amazon. It's an easy book to find. And Danny also mentioned his political activism, which he writes about in his latest book, Bloody Crossroads 2020, Art, Entertainment, and Resistance to Trump. Please leave us a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify. And we'd love it. We would truly love it if you'd follow the show. And go and check us out on TikTok. We are at What It Was Like Podcast. That's @ What It Was Like Podcast. And we've got the same handle on YouTube. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Tuffery. It was mixed by Jimmy Saunders, who also did our theme music. Darcy Humphreys is our intern. Our cover art is by Naomi Lee Beveridge. And this whole thing has been a Super Real production.